It was the first day of the new semester at one of the top universities in the country. The air outside was cool, and students rushed across the campus carrying books, coffee cups, and the excitement of a new beginning. Inside the mathematics building, the hallways smelled faintly of chalk and old paper. The sound of footsteps echoed as students searched for their classrooms. In one of the lecture rooms, the sunlight streamed through tall windows, lighting up rows of wooden desks. The room looked ordinary, but that morning it would become the place where something unusual happened, something that would be remembered long after the semester ended. The professor for the advanced mathematics class, Professor Caldwell, was already there. He stood near the board, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at his notes. He was in his late 50s, known across the department for his strict teaching style and sharp tongue. Students respected him but also feared him. He didn't smile much, and he had a reputation for being unapproachable. He believed intelligence should be proven through pressure, and he rarely gave compliments. As students began to fill the room, he gave them a brief nod, but no greeting. His thin glasses glinted as he watched each face that entered. He didn't just look, he evaluated. Among the students was a young man named David Johnson. He was tall and quiet, with calm eyes that reflected thoughtfulness more than confidence. He had earned a scholarship after ranking among the top students in his high school and early college years. His love for math was genuine, not for the grades, not for the recognition, but for the beauty of numbers and patterns that others often overlooked. David took a seat in the middle row, opened his notebook, and waited. Around him, a low buzz of chatter filled the room as new classmates greeted one another. Professor Caldwell cleared his throat, and the room fell silent immediately. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady but cold. "This is advanced theoretical mathematics. Some of you will do well. Most of you won't, but we will see." The words hung in the air. No one dared to respond. He turned to the chalkboard and began to write quickly. Chalk dust floated in the sunlight like tiny snowflakes. He filled the board with a complicated-looking equation that stretched across 3 lines. When he finished, he stepped aside and turned to face the class. "Here," he said, tapping the equation with his chalk, "is something that will tell me what kind of students I have this semester." Everyone leaned forward, some already scribbling the equation into their notebooks. The symbols and numbers looked dense, intimidating. David copied it down carefully, but as his pencil moved, he began to notice something strange. The structure didn't make sense. The first part of the equation didn't align with the second, and one of the assumptions was mathematically impossible. He frowned slightly, his pencil stopping midway. He looked at the board again, reading it carefully. It wasn't just a tricky question, it was wrong. There was no way it could be solved because it violated basic mathematical logic. David hesitated. He glanced at the professor, who was pacing slowly in front of the room, his hands still behind his back. Professor Caldwell finally spoke. "I'll give you 10 minutes to try. If any of you can solve it, I'll be impressed, but I doubt it." The students bent over their papers, writing furiously. Some tried plugging in different values. Others stared blankly at the board. David, however, couldn't bring himself to start. He wasn't sure if he should say something. He had heard about Professor Caldwell before, that he didn't take kindly to being questioned. But the more he looked, the clearer it became. This equation wasn't just difficult, and it was designed to fail. After a few minutes, he took a slow breath and raised his hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think there might be a problem with the equation." The professor stopped walking. The room went completely still. Everyone turned to look at David. Professor Caldwell tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk forming on his face. "A problem, you say?" "Yes, sir," David said calmly. "The first assumption seems inconsistent with the later part. It doesn't lead to a valid solution." A few students exchanged nervous glances. No one ever interrupted Caldwell. The professor stepped closer to the board, then looked back at David. "Are you suggesting I made an error?" David swallowed. "I'm just saying the structure doesn't seem possible." Caldwell let out a small laugh. Not a warm one, but the kind that carried sarcasm. "Young man, perhaps you should review your fundamentals before making bold statements." A few people in the room chuckled quietly, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. David felt a rush of heat rise to his face, but he didn't lower his eyes. He simply nodded and said, "Yes, sir." The professor continued pacing, clearly satisfied. "Mathematics requires humility, Mr. Johnson," David replied. Yes, Mr. Johnson. Remember, confidence is not a substitute for knowledge. The words stung a little, but David didn't argue. He just looked down at his notebook and started studying the equation again. 10 minutes later, the professor clapped his hands once. Time's up. As expected, no one solved it. It's all right. It was meant to challenge you. He wiped the board clean, leaving behind faint traces of chalk dust. Now let's move on to something simpler, he said, turning to a new topic as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. David couldn't shake it off. As the class went on, he barely heard the rest of the lecture. His mind kept replaying that equation. Why would a professor purposely write something false? Was it an honest mistake or a deliberate test? When the lecture ended, students packed their things and hurried out, but David stayed behind for a moment. The professor was gathering his notes. "Sir," David said softly as he approached. Caldwell looked up, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to sound disrespectful earlier," David said. "It's just, I checked the equation again and it really does seem inconsistent." The professor sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but not everything needs to be questioned. Sometimes it's better to observe and learn before trying to correct." "Yes, sir," David said again. But as he walked out of the classroom, something in him refused to let it go. Outside, the afternoon sun had turned warm, and students were sitting on the campus lawns, laughing, talking, or typing on their laptops. But David's mind was somewhere else. He found a quiet bench under a tree and took out his notebook. He rewrote the same equation from memory line by line. Then slowly he began to break it down. He analyzed the logic, followed the steps backward, and tried to find where it broke. Within minutes he found it again, a contradiction right in the foundation. There was no doubt anymore. The equation was false. He couldn't decide what bothered him more, that the professor had made a mistake or that he had done it on purpose. That night, David sat at his small desk in the dorm. His roommate was out, so the room was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock. His desk lamp glowed over his open notebooks. He decided to do something he often did when faced with a problem: rebuild it. He started from the same premise but adjusted it slightly, correcting the false assumption. Then he worked forward, writing long chains of numbers, letters, and symbols. Every few minutes he paused, erasing something, then rewriting. Hours passed. Outside the window, the sky darkened and the campus lights flickered on. Finally, he reached a point where everything clicked. The corrected version of the equation didn't just make sense, it revealed something deeper, an elegant pattern hidden behind the original structure. It was almost poetic in its balance. David leaned back in his chair, staring at what he had written. He smiled faintly, feeling that quiet thrill that comes only when the numbers finally speak the truth. He looked at the board one more time in his mind. The chalk, the smirk, the silence. Maybe the professor had wanted to test him. Maybe he had wanted to see if anyone would dare to challenge him. If that was the case, David thought, then the test wasn't over yet. He closed his notebook carefully and placed it on his desk. Tomorrow he would show the professor what he had found, not to prove him wrong, but to prove that truth in mathematics, like in life, should never depend on who holds the chalk. He turned off the lamp and lay down, the glow of the streetlights faintly touching his walls. His mind still played with numbers as he drifted to sleep, unaware that his quiet determination that night would soon turn into something that would surprise not just his professor, but the entire department. The next morning came quietly. The campus was still damp from a light rain that had fallen overnight. The walkways glistened under the soft morning light, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. David woke up early, though he hadn't slept much. His mind had been restless, replaying the same thought again and again. The equation, the smirk on the professor's face, and the question he had left unanswered. He dressed neatly, packed his notebook, and stepped out of his dorm. The world outside felt calm, but inside he felt a mix of nervousness and determination. He wasn't sure how Professor Caldwell would react to him showing up with his own version of the equation. But something inside told him he had to do it. Not for pride, not to prove anything, but simply because it was right. When he entered the classroom, the professor wasn't there yet. A few students were already seated, chatting quietly. David sat in the same spot as yesterday and opened his notebook. He looked at the pages he had worked on all night. Clean, precise lines of logic, each step building on the next. It felt solid. True. A few minutes later, Professor Caldwell walked in. The room instantly quieted down. He placed his notes on the desk and began the lecture without wasting time. His voice was sharp as usual, every sentence crisp and controlled. As the class went on, David tried to focus, but his attention drifted. He waited for the right moment. His heart thumped in his chest as the professor turned to the board to write another formula. Finally, during a short pause, David gathered his courage and raised his hand. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "about the equation from yesterday. I worked on it last night. May I show you something?" The professor stopped writing and turned around slowly. His expression didn't change, but the room sensed the shift in energy. The students turned to look at David again, curious. Professor Caldwell adjusted his glasses and said, "You're still thinking about that?" "Yes, sir." "I couldn't stop thinking about it," David said. "I believe I found the issue, and also a possible correction." The professor's eyebrows lifted slightly. For a second there was silence. Then, with a tone that mixed amusement and doubt, he said, "Very well. Show me what you have." David stood up, walked to the front of the class, and placed his notebook on the desk. His palms were a little sweaty, but his voice stayed calm. He pointed to the first line of his notes and began to explain. He started with the same equation that the professor had written, the one that couldn't be solved. Then, line by line, he showed where it broke. His explanation was clear, and even though he spoke softly, every word carried a quiet confidence. At first, some of the students looked confused. Then, as he continued, a few began nodding slowly. They could see it, the flaw in the logic and how David had corrected it. When he finished, there was a moment of complete silence. You could almost hear the sound of chalk dust settling. Professor Caldwell stared at the notebook. His face was unreadable. Then he picked it up and looked closely at the equations. He didn't say a word for several long seconds. Finally, he placed the notebook down carefully and said, "Class dismissed." Everyone froze. It was only halfway through the lecture. The students hesitated, unsure whether to leave or stay, but the professor repeated himself. "You're dismissed. Mr. Johnson, stay for a moment." As the room emptied, whispers filled the air. Some students looked impressed, others shocked. One student patted David's shoulder as he passed. "That was bold," he whispered. When the door finally closed and the room grew quiet, the professor spoke. "You worked on this all night?" "Yes, sir," David replied. The professor's eyes remained on the notebook. "And you're certain this correction is valid?" "I checked it several times," David said. "I even ran it through a few alternative approaches. It holds true." The professor leaned back against the desk, arms crossed. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You realize that equation wasn't a mistake?" David blinked, unsure how to respond. "You mean, you wrote it wrong on purpose?" Caldwell gave a faint nod. "It was a test, not of mathematics, but of perception." David frowned slightly. "To see if someone would question you?" The professor's tone softened, though only a little. "To see if someone would notice. Most students don't question what's written on the board. They assume everything is correct because it comes from authority. You were the only one who did." David didn't know how to feel. Part of him was relieved to know it wasn't an accident. Another part felt slightly unsettled, that the professor had done it to provoke. "Why me?" David asked quietly. The professor's gaze met his, sharp and deliberate. "Because you walked in with confidence, and confidence invites challenge." David said nothing. He just nodded slowly. Professor Caldwell sighed and handed the notebook back. "Your correction is impressive. You found the flaw and built something better. But remember, in mathematics as in life, truth doesn't depend on who speaks it. It stands on its own." David nodded again, his voice steady. "I understand, sir." "Good," the professor said, turning back to his desk. "You can go." David left the classroom feeling a mix of pride and confusion. The test, the challenge, the strange tone of the conversation. It all felt bigger than a simple math problem. That evening, he sat with a few classmates in the library. They were curious about what had happened after they left. "So what did he say?" one of them asked. David hesitated for a moment, then replied, "He said it was a test." "Seriously?" another student said. Kind of unfair. David smiled faintly. Maybe. But I think he just wanted to see how people think. One of his classmates shook his head. Still, man, you stood up to him. Nobody does that. David laughed softly. I wasn't trying to stand up to him. I just wanted to understand. Later that night, back in his dorm, David received an email notification. It was from Professor Caldwell. Mr. Johnson, the email began, your analytical insight today was remarkable. If you are free tomorrow afternoon, I would like you to visit my office. I have something I'd like to discuss. David read the message twice, surprised. He wasn't sure whether to feel honored or nervous, but he knew he would go. The next afternoon, he walked to the professor's office on the top floor of the mathematics building. The hallway was quiet. The walls were lined with framed research papers and photos of past faculty. He knocked gently on the door. Come in, the professor's voice called. The office smelled of coffee and old books. Stacks of papers were piled neatly on the desk, and chalkboards on the wall were filled with half-erased equations. Ah, Mr. Johnson, the professor said without looking up from his notes. Sit down. David sat. I looked again at your correction, the professor said finally. It's not only valid, it's elegant. That's rare, David smiled slightly. Thank you, sir. The professor leaned forward, studying him. You see patterns most people miss. That's a gift, but it's also a responsibility. Use it carefully. David nodded, unsure how to reply. The professor continued. I'll be honest. When I saw you yesterday, I wondered how long you would last in this class. But today you reminded me why I teach. To be surprised. There was a brief silence, then the professor added, keep working. I'll expect more from you now. David thanked him quietly and left the office. As he walked down the hallway, a strange feeling came over him. Not just relief, but inspiration. It wasn't about being right anymore. It was about learning to trust his own understanding, even when others doubted it. That evening, as the sun set, he sat under the same tree as before, the wind brushing gently through the leaves. He opened his notebook again, this time starting a fresh page. He began to write not the professor's equations, but his own ideas, small patterns he had noticed, connections he wanted to explore. He realized something important. It wasn't just about solving what others gave him. It was about seeing what others couldn't see yet. And though he didn't know it at that moment, this quiet persistence would soon open doors he never imagined possible. The following week brought a change that few people noticed, but David felt it deeply. Ever since that day in the classroom, things had felt different. The professor, once cold and distant, had started looking at him differently, not as just another student, but as someone worth watching. During lectures, when Professor Caldwell asked difficult questions, his eyes often turned toward David. Sometimes he even paused mid-sentence and asked, Mr. Johnson, how would you approach this? The first time it happened, the entire class turned to look at him. He hesitated, unsure if it was another test, but he answered carefully. When he finished, the professor gave a single approving nod before moving on. That small gesture was enough to make David realize something had shifted between them, a quiet respect, perhaps even curiosity. But not everyone felt the same way. Some of the other students started to notice the attention David was getting. Whispered comments followed him in the hallways. He's the professor's favorite now, someone said once, not quite quietly enough. Others rolled their eyes whenever the professor praised his work. David tried not to let it bother him. He wasn't doing any of it for attention. He just loved math, that was all. He would spend hours in the library scribbling notes, trying to explore ideas that had begun to form since that night he found the false equation. Sometimes he stayed there long after everyone else had gone, the sound of pencils scratching paper, the smell of old books, and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights became his nightly rhythm. One evening, as he sat by the window in the library, a thought came to him. What if he could build a new model? Something that connected the professor's old equation to the corrected version he had made. It could reveal patterns others hadn't noticed yet. He flipped open his notebook and started working. His handwriting moved quickly across the page. Each symbol, each line of logic connected to the next. Hours passed without him realizing it. When he finally leaned back, he looked at what he had created. A series of formulas that seemed to breathe on their own. It wasn't perfect yet, but there was something powerful there. He knew he needed to show it to someone who would understand. The next morning, he waited outside Professor Caldwell's office. The hallway was empty except for the faint sound of chalk squeaking from a nearby classroom. He held his notebook tightly in his hands, his fingers slightly trembling. After a few minutes, the office door opened and the professor appeared. He looked surprised to see David waiting. "Good morning, sir," David said. "I've been working on something. I think it's connected to the correction I showed you before." The professor gestured for him to come inside. "Let's see it." David sat across from him and placed the notebook on the desk. He began to explain what he had been developing, how the new equation built on the corrected one, how it could potentially model certain systems more accurately. For the first few minutes, the professor said nothing. He listened, occasionally glancing down at the notebook. Then, as David continued, his expression began to change. His eyebrows lifted slightly and his eyes sharpened with focus. When David finished, the professor leaned back in his chair, staring at the notebook for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Where did you learn this approach?" "I didn't," David said honestly. "I just followed where the logic led." The professor studied him silently, then said, "You realize this method isn't in any textbook?" David nodded. "Yes, sir. I just wanted to see if it could work." The professor's tone softened. "You didn't just make it work. You found a connection that people have been trying to formalize for years." David blinked, not sure what to say. "Really?" "Yes," the professor said. "It's similar to a model used in advanced research, but your version is simpler and more elegant. That's rare." He stood up and began pacing slowly around the office. "You have a mind for discovery, Mr. Johnson. That's not something you can teach." David felt a wave of warmth in his chest. "Thank you, sir." The professor turned toward him again. "How would you feel about working with me on a paper? We could explore your findings together, develop them properly." David stared at him, almost unsure he had heard correctly. "A paper? With you?" "Yes," Caldwell said with a faint smile. "You've earned it." For a few seconds, David couldn't speak. He had come to this university on a scholarship, hoping only to learn from the best. The idea that he might work alongside one of the top professors in the department felt almost unreal. "I'd be honored," he finally said. And so it began. Over the next few weeks, David spent hours in the professor's office working through equations, testing ideas and refining their model. They debated theories, challenged each other, and even laughed at mistakes. The once intimidating professor became more like a mentor, demanding but genuinely supportive. Sometimes, when they worked late, the professor would share stories from his own early days. He spoke of the time he too had been a student who questioned authority, who made mistakes, and who learned through persistence. "You remind me of myself," he said one evening, almost smiling. "Only you might end up better," David chuckled. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness," the professor replied. "It's fact." As word spread about their research, other professors started taking notice. A few even invited David to attend discussions that were normally closed to undergraduates. The first time he sat in one of those rooms, surrounded by academics twice his age, he felt both nervous and proud. But not everyone was pleased. Some students whispered that he was only getting attention because he had embarrassed the professor earlier in the semester. Others said he was showing off. David tried to ignore it, but there were moments when it stung. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just loved the work. One afternoon, as he sat alone in the library, a fellow student approached him. "You really think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" the student said, half smiling but clearly irritated. David looked up, surprised. "No, I don't think that at all." "Come on," the student said. "You questioned the professor, now you're his research partner. Some of us work just as hard." David closed his notebook calmly. "I know you do, I just follow what interests me." The student shook his head and walked away. After that, David kept even more to himself. He focused on his work, spending long hours in the math lab trying to make their new formula more efficient. He didn't realize it then, but what he was building would eventually become part of something much larger. A few weeks later, the professor called him into his office again. On the desk was a printed draft of their paper. The title had both their names. "Congratulations," the professor said. "It's ready to submit." David picked up the pages, feeling their weight. "I can't believe this is real." The professor nodded. "You've earned it, Mr. Johnson. This will get attention, serious attention." He paused, then added, But there's one thing I want you to remember. The world won't always see you for your mind first. Sometimes people will test you, doubt you, or expect less from you. Don't let that define you. Let your work speak." David nodded slowly, the words settling deep in his heart. That evening he walked out of the building and stood for a while under the fading sky. The air was cool and the campus lights were just beginning to glow. He thought about everything that had happened since that first day. The false equation, the embarrassment, the long nights, and now this. He smiled to himself. What had started as a moment of doubt had turned into something far greater. He hadn't just solved a problem. He had found his purpose. As he walked back toward his dorm, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his classmates. "Saw your name on the department board." "Congratulations," David replied simply. "Thank you." He put his phone away and looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, scattered across the darkness, but they were there, constant, patient, shining quietly above. Just like numbers, he thought. Always there, waiting for someone to see them differently. He smiled and whispered to himself, "Let the work speak." And it would. The day the paper was officially accepted felt almost unreal. When David walked into the department that morning, he didn't expect to find a small group of professors already gathered around the announcement board. They were talking in low voices, pointing at a printed notice pinned to the top corner. His name was there, right next to Professor Caldwell's, listed as co-author of a research paper that had just been approved for publication in an academic journal. For a moment, David simply stood there staring at it. He felt a rush of pride mixed with disbelief. His hands trembled slightly as he traced his name on the paper with his eyes. It wasn't about fame or attention. It was about what it meant. Every late night, every doubt, every quiet moment when he wondered if he was good enough, all of it had led to this. When the professor walked in a few minutes later, the crowd turned toward him. For the first time anyone could remember, he was smiling openly. He walked over to David, nodded once, and said in a clear voice, "Congratulations. Mr. Johnson, you've earned this." The other professors clapped lightly. Some genuinely impressed, others perhaps surprised. A few students standing nearby joined in, their eyes wide. David smiled politely, though his face was warm from embarrassment. He wasn't used to attention. Later that day, as the campus buzzed with news of the paper, David sat under his favorite tree, notebook in hand. The sun filtered gently through the leaves, scattering patches of light across his pages. He wrote quietly, not about equations this time, but about what he had learned, about patience, truth, and the strange way life tested people when they least expected it. He didn't know it, but at that very moment, something else was happening inside the mathematics department. A few faculty members were discussing the paper, and not all of them were happy. One professor, a senior colleague of Caldwell's, leaned back in his chair and said, "It's impressive work, I'll give you that. But publishing something so significant with an undergraduate, it's unusual." Another nodded. "People are already talking. They're saying Caldwell is exaggerating the boy's role." Professor Caldwell, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned to face them. His voice was calm but firm. "I'm not exaggerating anything. The original correction, the concept that led to the model, it all came from him. I only helped refine it." "That may be," the other professor said, "but you know how people are. They'll question it." "Let them," Caldwell replied. "The work will speak for itself." That night, David received another email from the professor. It was short but meaningful. "You've done something remarkable. Remember, no one can take that away from you. Come to tomorrow's lecture. There's something I need to say to the class." The next morning, the lecture room filled up earlier than usual. Word had spread that the professor had something important to announce. David sat quietly in his usual seat, trying not to attract attention, but everyone kept glancing at him. When Professor Caldwell entered, the room fell silent. He set his books down, then turned to the board, but instead of writing anything, he faced the students directly. "Last month," he began, "I gave this class an equation that was, by design, unsolvable. It was meant as a lesson, not in mathematics, but in observation. I wanted to see who among you would notice what was wrong." He paused, scanning the room. One student did. And not only did he notice, he corrected it, and created something better. What began as a challenge has now become published research. A quiet murmur moved through the class. Several students turned toward David, who sat frozen, unsure where to look. The professor continued. Mr. Johnson's work reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago, that brilliance can come from anywhere. That real talent has nothing to do with what you expect, but with the courage to see what others overlook. He glanced briefly in David's direction, and so I owe him an apology. That first equation, it was meant to test him, but in truth it tested me. The room was completely silent. Then, as the words sank in, applause broke out. It started with a few claps, then grew louder until nearly everyone was on their feet. David sat still for a moment, overwhelmed. He had never imagined this, an apology, a public acknowledgement, and from a man like Caldwell. The professor's eyes met his for a second, and in that moment no words were needed. Respect had replaced the distance that once stood between them. After class, as students crowded around to congratulate him, David felt both proud and humble. One student said, "You changed how he teaches, you know." David laughed softly. "Maybe he changed me too." Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. The paper gained attention beyond the university. A few academic blogs mentioned it, and David began receiving messages from students at other schools, thanking him for inspiring them. He replied to as many as he could, always keeping his tone simple and kind. He didn't see himself as anyone special, just someone who loved learning. One afternoon, Professor Caldwell called him into his office again. This time he looked tired but content. "They've invited us to present our paper at the Regional Mathematics Conference next month," he said. "It's a big opportunity." David's heart skipped a beat. "They want me to present?" The professor nodded. "You're the one who discovered it." "I'll be there, of course, but you'll lead the presentation." David hesitated. "I don't know if I can do that. I've never spoken in front of that many people." Caldwell smiled faintly. "You'll do fine. You've already done the hard part, finding the truth. Speaking it is the easy part." The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. David practiced every day, standing in front of a mirror or an empty classroom, going over every line of his explanation. Sometimes he stumbled, sometimes he forgot what to say, but he kept practicing until his voice stopped shaking. The night before the conference, he barely slept. He lay awake in his dorm, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment when everything had started. That first day, that false equation, the laughter, the embarrassment. It felt like a lifetime ago. The morning of the presentation, the conference hall was filled with professors, researchers, and students from different universities. The air buzzed with quiet excitement. When his name was called, David walked to the stage with his notes in hand. The lights were bright and his heart pounded in his chest. But when he looked out at the crowd, he saw Professor Caldwell sitting in the front row. Giving him a calm nod, he took a deep breath and began to speak. At first, his voice was soft, almost hesitant, but as he moved from one idea to the next, he found his rhythm. He explained how the false equation had led him to a deeper discovery, how questioning what seemed certain had revealed something beautiful and true. By the time he finished, the hall was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that means people are thinking, processing, feeling. Then came the applause. It filled the room, echoing through the space. Afterward, several professors came up to him to ask questions, offer congratulations, and even invite him to apply for graduate research programs. One said, "You've got a rare gift. Don't lose it." When the hall finally emptied and the noise faded, David turned to Professor Caldwell. "Thank you," he said quietly. The professor smiled. "No, thank you. You reminded me why I became a teacher." They walked out of the building together, the sun just beginning to set over the campus skyline. For a moment, neither spoke. There was no need to. The silence between them felt peaceful, the kind of silence that comes when something important has been understood. Later that night, as David packed his notes away, he thought about how much had changed. The false equation that once felt like a trap had become the foundation for everything that followed. What was meant to test him had revealed who he truly was, and not just a student, but someone who saw meaning where others saw confusion. He smiled quietly to himself, whispering the same words the professor once told him, "Let the work speak." It already had. After the conference, life began to feel a little different for David. It wasn't that he had changed, at least not on the outside. He still walked the campus paths quietly, still spent hours in the library, and still carried his notebook wherever he went. But something inside him had shifted. He had learned through every challenge, every doubt, and every long night of thinking that confidence wasn't about being loud. It wasn't about impressing anyone or proving who was smarter. True confidence came from knowing your own mind, trusting your own reasoning, and being willing to stand for what you knew was right. The weeks that followed were filled with new opportunities. Other professors began inviting him to seminars and discussions. Students started coming to him for advice, not just about mathematics, but about how to approach challenges in life. He had become quietly a source of inspiration. One afternoon, as he was sitting in his usual spot under a tree, writing notes for his next project, a younger student approached him nervously. "Excuse me," the student said, fidgeting with his backpack straps. "I heard about your work. I don't know much about advanced mathematics, but I want to learn. Could you help me understand some of this?" David looked up, saw the hope in the student's eyes, and smiled. "Of course," he said. "Let's start with the basics. Everything else will come later." It was moments like this, and small, quiet, human moments, that reminded him why he loved learning so much. It wasn't about recognition or awards. It was about sharing knowledge, helping others see the world differently, and giving them the courage to think for themselves. Meanwhile, Professor Caldwell continued to mentor him. Their research had grown into a larger project, one that would eventually be published in multiple journals. But even with all the recognition, Caldwell reminded him constantly of something important. "Remember," he said one afternoon while reviewing a draft of their latest work, "no matter how far you go, stay humble. Always let your work speak before you do." David nodded. "I will, sir." The professor looked at him thoughtfully. "You've taught me as much as I've taught you. That's the truth. I forgot how important it is to see talent where you least expect it. You reminded me, and that's something I will never forget." David felt a warmth he hadn't expected. It wasn't pride. It was respect. Deep, mutual respect between teacher and student. As months passed, David began to notice subtle changes in the department. Other students, even those who had once been skeptical or jealous, started asking for guidance and looking to him as a mentor. Some were timid at first, afraid of being wrong, but he never judged them. He helped them learn slowly and patiently, showing them that mistakes weren't failures, they were opportunities. One evening, after a long day in the library, he walked through the campus and saw the familiar chalkboard outside the math building. He remembered the first day of the semester, the false equation, the smirk on Professor Caldwell's face, and the moment he had realized he had to trust his own mind. He touched the edge of the board lightly, thinking about how one small test, one small moment had changed everything. The false equation had been meant to intimidate him, but it had become the spark that revealed who he really was. A student who loved learning, a thinker who questioned carefully, and someone who refused to be defined by anyone's low expectations. Later that night, he sat in his dorm and wrote in his notebook. Not formulas, not equations, but reflections. He wrote about courage, about persistence, about truth, and about the quiet way people can rise above doubt and prejudice when they believe in themselves. He remembered the professor's words. "No one can take that away from you." They weren't just words about mathematics. They were about life, about knowing your own worth, and about refusing to let anyone else decide it for you. David's research continued to gain recognition. Invitations to speak at conferences and workshops arrived from across the country. Every time he felt nervous, wondering if he was ready, but he reminded himself of the first day that challenged the false equation. If he had faced that, he could face anything. When he presented his work, he spoke clearly, honestly, and with humility. People listened. They asked questions, challenged ideas, and sometimes disagreed, but David welcomed it all. He had learned that growth didn't come from applause. It came from engagement, from discussion, from seeing your work through the eyes of others and being willing to refine it. Years later, after graduating with honors and receiving multiple awards, David returned to the same university, not as a student, but as a teacher. He walked into a classroom filled with young students, each with their notebooks and hopeful eyes. He smiled quietly. Some reminded him of himself, nervous, uncertain, but full of curiosity. Others were bold, confident, and ready to challenge everything. He thought back to Professor Caldwell and the false equation, and he knew exactly how he wanted to teach. Not with intimidation, not with fear, but with encouragement, with challenges that inspired, questions that provoked thought, and the belief that every student, no matter their background, could rise above expectation if they were given a chance. On the first day of his own class, he wrote on the board, carefully and clearly, a simple problem. It wasn't a trap, it wasn't designed to fail. It was a puzzle, something to get his students thinking. He stepped back and smiled as they began to work. Some looked unsure. Some were confident. A few glanced up at him, gauging his reaction. David walked slowly among the desks, observing, offering guidance when needed, but never judging. He paused at one student, a quiet young woman with intense focus, and said softly, "Trust your reasoning. It will guide you." As he continued around the room, he realized that he had come full circle. What had begun as a test, as a moment of doubt and challenge, had turned into a legacy. Not just a published paper, not just recognition or awards, but the quiet, enduring impact of inspiring others. Outside the classroom, the campus buzzed with life. Students walked to and from classes, laughed under the trees, and argued passionately over ideas. David watched them for a moment, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He knew the world would always be full of challenges. Some would test him. Some would doubt him, some would underestimate him. But he also knew that truth, persistence, and genuine curiosity would always guide him, and now he had the privilege to pass that on to others. Later that evening, when the sun was setting and the campus was quiet, he walked alone through the same paths he had once walked as a student. He looked up at the sky, noticing the faint stars beginning to appear. They reminded him of patterns, constellations, and the quiet beauty of discovering something hidden. He thought about the first day, the equation, the moment he chose to trust his mind. It had been terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. It had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also revealed who he really was. And now, as a teacher, he realized that the true measure of success wasn't in solving equations, publishing papers, or receiving praise. It was in inspiring others to see, to think, and to believe in their own abilities. David smiled softly to himself. The work had spoken. The truth had been recognized. And the lessons of courage, patience, and quiet determination, would continue through the lives of every student he taught. He opened his notebook one last time that night, writing a few final lines before closing it. Not formulas, not equations, just reflections on the journey. Trust yourself, follow the truth, work hard, encourage others. And always remember, brilliance can come from anywhere, even from a quiet mind willing to see what others cannot. He closed the notebook, stood by the window, and looked out at the campus one last time that evening. The lights glowed softly, the wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in a quiet classroom a new student was discovering the thrill of learning. David knew, in that moment, that everything had come full circle. The false equation, the challenge, the long nights of work, the doubt, and the discovery, they had all led to this. A life not just filled with knowledge, but with purpose. And as he finally turned off the light and left the room, he whispered to himself, as he had so many times before, "Let the work speak. It always would."